He was polite. His neighbors described him as friendly. He helped elderly women carry groceries. He volunteered at a youth center. And between 1978 and 1991, Ted Bundy confessed to murdering 30 people, though investigators believe the true number is higher. The question is not how someone becomes capable of that. The question, the one that forensic scientists, neurologists, and FBI profilers have spent 50 years trying to answer, is why some people are born wired to enjoy it. There are currently more than 35 documented active serial killers operating in the United States at any given time, according to FBI estimates. Worldwide, researchers identify over 400 new cases per decade. And the most disturbing finding from 50 years of psychological research is not about the killers themselves. It is about how ordinary they look, how ordinary they test, and how many of them have lived among us for years before anyone suspected a thing. This is what the science actually shows about the mind behind the crime. In this video, we are going inside 50 years of FBI research, neuroscience, and forensic psychology to answer 3 questions. What does the brain of a serial killer actually look like compared to yours? What childhood and environmental factors appear in nearly every case history? And, perhaps most unsettling, why every major expert warns that profiling is not the reliable tool crime dramas make it look. Let's start with the brain itself, because the research here is more concrete and more disturbing than most people realize. Neuroimaging studies conducted on convicted serial killers and violent psychopaths consistently show measurable structural and functional differences in 2 key regions. The first is the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for impulse control, decision-making, emotional regulation, and empathy. In the brains of individuals diagnosed with psychopathy, which appears in approximately 20 to 30% of incarcerated serial killers, the prefrontal cortex shows significantly reduced gray matter volume and reduced activation during tasks that require processing the emotions of others. In plain terms, the brake system is smaller and it responds less. The second key region is the amygdala, your brain's emotional alarm system. The amygdala triggers fear, processes threat, and, critically, generates the distress response when you witness someone else in pain. Studies using fMRI scanners have shown that when psychopathic individuals are shown images of other people suffering, their amygdala response is measurably blunted compared to non-psychopathic controls. They process the image, they understand intellectually what they are seeing, but the automatic, involuntary emotional response, the thing that makes most of us recoil, is simply not triggering at normal levels. It is not that they feel nothing, it is that the alarm never goes off.
Now the psychology, specifically the 3 childhood behavioral markers that appear in the case histories of serial killers with a frequency that researchers and FBI profilers found striking enough to formally document. These are known as the McDonald triad, named for psychiatrist J.M. McDonald, who identified the pattern in 1963. The 3 markers are persistent bedwetting beyond the normal age of development, animal cruelty, and fire setting. All 3 appeared in the childhood histories of Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Wayne Gacy. The FBI's landmark 1985 study of 36 convicted sexual murderers found these markers present across the majority of case histories. Here is the critical nuance that gets lost in popular coverage. The McDonald triad is not a predictive checklist. Most people who exhibited one or more of these behaviors in childhood did not become killers. The vast majority did not. What the triad identifies is not a sentence, but a signal, a pattern of behavior that, when present alongside other risk factors, parental abuse, neglect, head trauma, social isolation, creates a compounding vulnerability. No single factor makes a killer, but every factor that compounds makes the outcome more probable. In 1985, FBI agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas, the men who effectively invented modern criminal profiling, published the results of a study that would become one of the most referenced documents in forensic science. They had personally interviewed 36 convicted sexual murderers, including some of the most notorious names in American criminal history. What they found was not what they expected. They expected to find broken, obviously disturbed individuals, the monsters of popular imagination. Instead, they found men who were predominantly intelligent, often articulate, frequently employed, and almost universally capable of appearing completely normal in social situations. The violence was not a surface condition, it was invisible until it wasn't. Consider what the data shows about 3 specific cases, not to sensationalize, but to illustrate the pattern. Ted Bundy, law student, crisis hotline volunteer, described by professors as brilliant and promising. His killing spree lasted 6 years and crossed multiple states before he was caught through a traffic stop, not through profiling, not through pattern analysis, but because a patrolman noticed expired license plates. Jeffrey Dahmer, quiet, employed at a chocolate factory, described by coworkers as someone who kept to himself. He killed 17 men over 13 years. His neighbors twice reported strange odors and sounds to the police. The police visited. They left. John Wayne Gacy, local businessman, Democratic Party precinct captain, performed as Pogo the Clown at children's parties. He was convicted of murdering 33 people.
One of the most consistent findings across all major studies is what forensic psychologists call the fantasy escalation model. In interview after interview, from Bundy to Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, subjects described a remarkably similar internal process, a childhood or adolescent fantasy, initially passive and disconnected from reality, that gradually became more detailed, more violent, more urgent, and eventually crossed into rehearsal behavior before the first actual crime. Bundy described it as a compulsion that grew alongside him, becoming increasingly difficult to contain. Rader called it his dark side, a parallel internal life that operated completely invisible to everyone around him for decades. What makes this model important and deeply uncomfortable is what it implies about detection. If the process unfolds internally over years or decades with no external manifestation visible to the people around the subject, then conventional warning signs become almost meaningless. Neighbors, colleagues, partners saw nothing, not because they were not paying attention, but because there was genuinely nothing to see. The offense had been occurring, in a psychological sense, for years. The physical world just hadn't caught up yet. Here is the part that criminologists say gets the least coverage. The science of criminal profiling, as portrayed in shows like Mindhunter, Criminal Minds, and Silence of the Lambs, is far less reliable than popular culture makes it appear. A comprehensive analysis published in the Journal of Investigative Psychology found that professional profilers perform no better than non-specialist police officers and only marginally better than untrained members of the public when attempting to predict an unknown offender's characteristics from crime scene evidence alone. The profiles generated by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, as valuable as they are as investigative tools, have a documented history of leading investigators toward wrong suspects and away from the actual perpetrator. The reason profiling is unreliable as a predictive tool is the same reason serial killers are so difficult to catch. There is no single profile. The white male loner in his 30s is a stereotype drawn from a subset of American cases from the 1970s and 1980s. Globally, serial killers are diverse across race, gender, age, profession, and modus operandi. Every time investigators anchor on a single profile type, they create a blind spot for everyone who doesn't match it.
Perhaps the most philosophically difficult finding in this entire field is what neuroscientist James Fallon discovered when he was conducting brain scans of violent psychopaths as part of a research study. Fallon noticed that one of the scan results, showing classic psychopathic brain patterns, including significantly reduced orbital cortex activity, was mixed in with his control group scans by mistake. When he traced the sample back, he discovered the scan belonged to him. Fallon had the neurological profile of a serial killer. He also had a documented family history of violent crime going back several generations, including multiple murderers on his maternal side. Fallon's case is not proof of a serial killer gene. What it demonstrates is the interaction model that neuroscience has increasingly converged on. Genetics loads the gun, creating a neurological vulnerability, a reduced capacity for empathy, a blunted alarm system. But environment pulls the trigger. Severe early trauma, abuse, neglect, and social isolation in childhood appear to be the necessary activation conditions. The biology creates the potential. The biography determines whether it is realized. So if profiling is unreliable and serial killers look indistinguishable from the general population, what actually catches them? The answer, drawn from case closure data, is almost anticlimactic. The majority are identified through routine, mundane police work. A traffic stop, a parking violation, a tip from a family member. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, who taunted police for 30 years, was caught because he sent investigators a floppy disk that contained metadata tracing back to his church. Ted Bundy, as previously noted, was caught by a routine traffic stop.
John Wayne Gacy was investigated after a missing teenager's family pointed police in his direction. The extraordinary mind is caught by the ordinary error, almost every time.
Here is what 50 years of research ultimately tells us. Serial killers are not supernatural. They are not a separate species. They are human beings in whom a specific convergence of neurological vulnerability, early trauma, and environmental reinforcement produced a capacity for violence that most people will never develop, but that exists on the same continuum of human behavior, not outside of it. And perhaps the most important implication of all this research is not about understanding the killers. It is about understanding the intervention points. If environment is the trigger, then environment is also the prevention. The data suggests that early intervention in childhood abuse, trauma treatment, and social connection does not just improve lives. It may, in a small number of cases, determine whether the gun ever gets fired. If this video changed how you think about the science behind the headlines, we cover exactly this kind of deep forensic and psychological analysis every week. Our video on the psychology of con artists goes inside the same manipulation architecture from a completely different angle. The link is on screen. And we want to know, which unsolved case do you most want us to investigate with this level of scientific detail? Drop it in the comments.